welcome back to session 4 of In the Wilderness Now. As this week we will be exploring the law and what that means today in the church. So how about we begin with a word of prayer?
Sounds good.
Let's pray. God of all grace, you call people into journeys. You asked a nomad named Abram to journey to a place where he would be a stranger in a strange land. Joseph journeyed into Egypt in chains and prepared the way for his family to seek refuge there in a time of drought. When that time for your people to journey back to the place you had promised arrived, you opened the Red Sea and led them through a wilderness journey that took them to the promised land. When your son came to earth, he too invited ordinary people into a journey of walking the hillsides and through the towns proclaiming a gospel based on love. And since Pentecost, your church has been on a journey, sometimes true to the gospel and sometimes veering to the left or to the right off the path of righteousness. So we invite your Spirit to be with us as we dip our toe into the uncertain future. And although anxious about where we're going, we'll go if you lead us. So we pray this in the name of the Good Shepherd, who leads his sheep into the green valleys and high places. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Patrick. What a great way to get started, and it is good to be back together for this video study session. Thanks for joining us. So perhaps one of the big events that people think of when they think about the Israelites wandering through the wilderness is the giving of the Ten Commandments.
Charlton Heston at his best.
Yes, one of the most famous biblical movies. So you have the Israelites as they've traveled through, they reach Mount Sinai, and God gives Moses the tablets of law. But you know, this event of giving the commandments actually happens pretty early in the entire Exodus story. There's a lot that's still yet to come, and maybe even some of the hardest moments are still ahead of the Israelite people. But even so far, as we have talked about over the last few weeks, God has already provided for them. God has given provisions such as clean water to drink, given them the ability to cross the Red Sea and avoid being taken by the Egyptian army. God provided manna and quail for them to eat. So God took care of all of their physical needs. Now we will find that the relationship with God continues. It gets a little more depth, a little more teeth into it. Because now God wants to help the Israelites with their social and relationship community. God wants to attend to their social and relationship needs. And that's where the Ten Commandments come into play.
Well, in Summa Theologica, I believe is how you say that.
That's great Latin there.
It is.
Summa Theologica.
Yes. With Thomas Aquinas, who was a Dominican friar and some would argue even the most influential theologian in all of Christianity post Paul, probably, yeah. And so we had mentioned St. Augustine last time, and Aquinas is right up there with Augustine, but Aquinas in Summa Theologica takes all of the various ways in which humanity creates laws and or has laws and rules and regulations and all of those things, and places them into some various categories. And without getting too in depth with it, one of those categories is natural law.
Okay.
Which is simply put the law of every single group of people, every society, every tribe. Where two or three are gathered, these laws tend to come up to the surface as a part of living together, as a part of being able to live in community. And so every society has a set of laws that really are the foundation of its function. And Aquinas says, well, 7 of these 10 are a part of every single society that he studied.
Okay.
Okay, so things like murdering someone, stealing or lying, and coveting are all no-nos, regardless of where you live, regardless of your society, regardless of even era. That really, from the very beginning, those are all no-nos, and we even see it with Cain and Abel. Even before it was written on the tablet, it was still a no-no to do. And so these are just those laws that naturally exist.
The ones that Thomas Aquinas really examples are ones that are unique, as he said, to the Judeo-Christian tradition. And those are the first 3 commandments. Thou shalt not have any other gods before me. Do not take the Lord's name in vain, and honor the Sabbath. So, as Patrick said, the rest of those laws are not specifically Christian or Jewish.
Right.
They are a natural law. They exist for any culture or any communities. But these other 3 are a little bit different. And so that's where Thomas Aquinas focused in on. And he looked at it and he said, because Judaism is a monotheistic religion, meaning that there's only one God.
Yeah.
And that was unique in the world up to that time. Most of the ancient Eastern religions had multiple gods. Probably the most common we're familiar with would be the Egyptians, or even the Romans and the Greeks.
Right.
You think about mythology, they had all kinds of Greek gods and goddesses. And so no other culture up to this time had a restriction that there was only one God. Let alone a relational God who wanted to be in relationship with the people in a helpful way.
Yeah.
So no other religion at the time had any restrictions about worshiping and honoring just one God. So, for example, a sun god of one culture wasn't offended if somebody made an offering to the rain god. Or the god of the sea wasn't offended when you worshiped the god of the sky. There was this, to use the Greek word, a pantheon of gods. And there was a whole mythic culture. So the allegiance to God, to honor God with our words, deeds, and motives, are what make the 10 Commandments different than other law codes of the ancient world. It's that idea of worshiping one God, honoring that God, and letting that God structure your life was very significant and very different.
Yep. And I think, too, it's worth noting, Abby, that as the Israelites approached Mount Sinai, that there was no kind of political system in place outside of whatever Moses ruled upon. In fact, I believe it's right before Mount Sinai that Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, comes and basically says, man, you've got to get some help.
Right, he was leading all these people by himself. Yeah,
that's right. And so, whereas a king or a prince would enforce laws to worship him, and in the ancient world it was always a hymn, that Moses did not require that. And in fact, Moses said, don't worship me, right? Worship the Lord. And very, very unique and distinctive as a culture, as an understanding of what God meant, and that separation between humanity and the divine that is not anywhere else in the world at this point, or that we've uncovered to this point anyway.
Sure.
And that God was their ruler. God was in charge, even though you couldn't necessarily touch, taste, feel, smell God. So and so again, it's just very different. Those laws on worship do emerge, and it's part of what is given on Mount Sinai, but coming up to it, there was nothing there, and so very unique.
Yeah. So with the idea of God being their ruler, why do you think God delivered a set of laws to these wilderness wandering people so early in their journey? After all, law codes were the work of the people settled into their home, and the Israelites were anything but settled. They didn't have their homeland yet. They hadn't arrived to the promised land. So why do you think that God gave them the 10 Commandments? Before we reveal our thoughts on why, we invite you to pause the video at this point and to discuss this question amongst yourselves. And why do you think that God gave the law to them just a few months into their journey? What difference does it make for this group of wandering people that God issued these laws? Go ahead and pause and think about that for a while. Share it with your group, and we'll see you in a few minutes. Welcome back. Did you have a good discussion? We certainly hope so. We're going to tell you a story here related to rules, maybe not laws, but Patrick and I have a blended family of 4, and I have 2 biological children. Patrick has 2 biological children, and together our rule of the house was that we love whoever we have whenever we have them. Maybe that was the law of our house.
Maybe.
But in addition, because of our blended family, our children lived in 2 homes. They had their home with us for the times they were with us, and then they had their home with their other parents when they lived with their other parents. So overall, in our family structure, we had 3 households that we were dealing with.
Yeah.
Because Matthew and Stephanie had their dad's household and ours, and then Nate and Abby had their mom's household and ours. And so because of this circumstance, which was none of the kids doing, they had a lot of rules to negotiate. Part of our job as parents was to help them be as stable as possible in whatever environment they were in. We tried to recognize that there was love in every home, and every home was different. And yet, in each home, there was a set of household rules.
Right.
So no matter where they were, they had some kind of rules. Some of them could have been the same, like bedtimes were the same across the board. That was something we agreed on. Or the fact that each child had to be a part of the household. They had to participate in the life of the home. In some homes, some of the rules were different. Maybe they didn't have quite the same chores in one home to the other. But nonetheless, they had ownership of their homes. Each child had their own rooms, and they had their own stuff, and they were given a home in any of those 3 places. Now, Patrick and I, we didn't wait until the kids were a certain age or until we were married for a certain period of time before we laid down our ground rules in our home. We did it right away. And we did this so that we could establish consistency from the very beginning. These rules were flexible over time, and they changed as the kids got older, but the children always had boundaries. of what was acceptable or not in our household. They knew the basic parameters of our home from the very beginning.
Well, if you don't have the divorce experience, well, first of all, be very thankful
Yes.
of that. And yet, the same principles that we're talking about, I think, here apply to children or even adults when they visit a different home. You have different rules at work than you have at home, and
Sure.
so these are kind of, again, like Aquinas might say, natural. These are just things that you learn. And in my experience, when I was growing up, one set of my grandparents had very strict rules about what you could touch, about what furniture you could sit on, what things you could play with, even to the extreme of what rooms in their house were off limits
Oh boy.
to children.
Sure.
And on the other side, kind of had an open, what I call the open door, open fridge, and open mind policy. If it's here, it's yours, and what's mine is yours. And her one rule was not to interrupt her while she was watching her stories. If my folks are watching, they're laughing right now. So,
Okay.
yeah. Other than that, we were just welcome to make ourselves at home rather than to simply be a guest, a temporary burden in some ways, it could feel like. And so, but we knew when you went to, this grandma's house, you were allowed to do these things. And then when you went to this grandma's house, you were allowed to do these things, and vice versa. Not, what you could do in one, you couldn't necessarily do in the other.
Sure. So we're going to ask you to pause again here in your group, or if you are watching this and reflecting by yourself, to think about this idea of having different rules in different contexts or different places. Think about your own experience of having different rules in houses, or maybe in different jobs, or maybe even in different roles of your life. How easy is it for you to navigate these rules? What is the hardest part? What do you struggle with? I invite you to think about those. Just pause the video for a minute and think about your interaction with the different rules in the different places in your life.
Well, we hope that was a beneficial discussion, and what we're trying to do is lay some groundwork here to answer the question that we asked before we paused it the first time. So let's continue to examine that, shall we? We felt that in our home it was very important to lay down those basic ground rules up front, right? That we wanted our children to have consistency, which
Sure.
is important for raising children and helping them to mature in healthy ways, and also for them to have certainty in their life with us. We know that children thrive when they can have predictions about their future. Whether it's-
Structure.
yeah. Whether it's dinner or consequences or bedtimes or whatever the case may be. Whether it was summer time or whether it was during school, whether it was a weekday or a weekend, it didn't really matter. Our general rules applied all the time. Yeah. So, no matter where they were or what time of the day it was, hitting and yelling were just not allowed.
Right.
I don't care how many times I had to tell Abby.
Darn it! Eventually, I got it. I
That's
think.
right.
But no, those were a couple of our
Right.
absolutes in our home.
Yes, absolutely. So, and on some of those things, it didn't matter whether it was a rule in their other parent's house or not. it was a rule in our house, and that's just the way that it was.
Sure. So as the Israelites went further and further into their wilderness, their individual and collective anxiety, it didn't disappear. In fact, it was quite the opposite.
Yep.
As they went along, as we'll see next week, even though they received a word from God, they've got these laws to help guide them. God's putting that certainty in place for them to say, hey, you do these things, you're going to be all right. They're still having trouble with that. So we'll learn more about that.
They're the only ones.
Yeah, right? Yeah. We'll learn more about that next week. So please stay tuned. But they're getting more and more anxious in this journey. And the isolation and vulnerability of their travel, now definitely not being able to go back to Egypt the way they were comfortable, the way they knew things, not knowing what their future was ahead of them, added these layers upon layers of anxiety. And so if you've ever gotten lost on a camping trip, or for me, it's losing my keys. And you lose your keys, and you know they've got to be here, and you can't find them, and now you're going to be late because you can't get to where you're going. And so that's one for me. But you imagine a scenario where your anxiety just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger until you resolve it. You might be able to relate to what we think the Israelites were experiencing at this time of getting some rules from God, but still not comfortable with them, and still not certain of what their life was going to be.
Yeah, I think of one of my fears as a parent was losing one of our kids in the mall.
Yeah,
and where do you even begin, right?
It's very
real.
real.
Yeah, and if you're watching this and you're like, I can get lost trying to get out of a paper bag, well, then you know exactly what the Israelites are going through at this point. But as such, which I think is important to establish here, that the Ten Commandments were supposed to be this counterweight to their group anxiety, and to provide them with certainty.
Yeah, it was actually supposed to be comforting in a way.
Yeah.
To say, here's your container of safety.
Right. Exactly.
It wasn't a list of rules. You have to do this. You have to do this. You have to do this. It was more, hey, keep in mind these things, and you're going to be all right.
Yeah. Well, no longer after Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, no longer do they ask to return to Egypt.
Okay.
So maybe it's working ever so slightly. Right? It doesn't mean that they stop complaining, mind you. Right? Even our kids, even though they had the rules, and picking up your room was one of those rules, didn't mean that they still didn't complain about it. Even as they were doing it. Sometimes not out of free will, but they were still doing it, right? But the dynamics of the situation involving the Israelites changed because of the grounding, the certainty, the guardrails, if you will, of what the law provided to them.
So as we transition to seeing what the application of the Israelites' story of receiving the Ten Commandments to how that applies to our journey of our church today, we want to point out that the original laws didn't stay with 10.
Right.
So as the journey continued, there were actually 613, what a great number, but 613 laws that God gave Moses that are written down in the Torah, the books of the law, from Leviticus and Deuteronomy. You can find all of these laws. But it wasn't enough for God to say, do not make any false idols and honor the Sabbath. it was necessary to outline exactly what that looked like. So the method of doing so, the shape of the altar, the quality of the offering, what types of offerings were to be given, what those offerings were consisted of, and how you were to prepare them. There's even laws allowing substitutes for those sacrifices. So if you didn't exactly have what was needed, then you could use this instead. And even the type of clothing that the priest had to wear, and what priests were allowed to do, and who was allowed to go into what rooms in the temple, and whatnot. So all of these details were also given when we think about the law. So also, when we think about these details, it looks like, there was actually, maybe as you do the math, about 60 laws for every commandment. And so
It's a lot of thou shalt nots.
it is a lot of thou shalt nots. And if you've ever tried to read directly through the book of Leviticus specifically, you start to read them and you're like, oh, wow, this is boring. It reads like a law book.
Right.
Well, that is why, because essentially it is.
Yep.
And in fact, some of the laws even included punishments for the offenses. If you started breaking these laws, now as the law was given, it outlined what the consequences were for breaking these laws.
Yep. Well, over time, the laws governing the commandments became sacred to the extent that rulings over the discrepancies in them had to be made. When one conflicted with another, or maybe something that wasn't in those 613 laws rubbed up against one of them, and so the priesthood were the arbiters of that, and so they began to rule if this, then that. In the book of that was put all together to collect those rulings, kind of like Supreme Court rulings, if you will.
That's what I was just thinking.
Yeah.
This is an ancient version of our legislation and the Supreme Court.
That's right. Yes, it is. But that was all called the Midrash, and so if you've heard of that term, that's what it's referring to. And just a couple of examples of what these things might cover would be, if your cow is giving birth to a calf on the Sabbath day, are you allowed to help in that birthing process?
Yeah.
Because, as we know around here, right, a lot of times they need help. And so, or do you just let the cow die and the calf along with it because, it's the Sabbath?
Right, you're honoring the Sabbath.
Right. So, how do you work through that? Or if your young bull ram gets out of the pasture and goes to a neighbor's farm and kills one of the ewes, then what? How do you work on that? And who's to blame for the fence being down? And so there's all these little intricate parts of things that had to be figured out. And so, as you might guess, over the years, the commandments, the laws, and the Midrash all became untouchable, rigid, if you will. The sacredness of them rose to new heights. And after about 1,000 years of existence, since the time of the Exodus, well, until the time when the Israelites were taken into captivity into Babylon, the primary reason that is given in the Bible for that exile is a lack of adherence to the law.
Right. We always hear about those unfaithful Israelites.
Right, yes. And so as such, when they returned from the exile, then the system that developed post-exile became much more much more rigid and much less amenable. The flexibility of how to interpret things was ruled out because look what happened the last time. God punished us, for trying to think things through. So, if it says it, it says it, and end of story. And that kind of rigidity made them really even miss the Messiah. That they could not see Jesus as Messiah because of how loose he was with some of the laws. The Sabbath. His disciples plucked grain off of a head of wheat on the Sabbath, and therefore there's no way that he could have been the Messiah. And in the Gospels, we hear this rigidity really as a code word or two. Pharisee would be one, right? Bom, bom, bom. Whenever you hear the word Pharisee, it's not good.
Right, the sticklers of the law.
Right, yes. Or Sadducees, is the other group alongside them. And so when you run in through that in the gospel passages, you kind of know that's what is being dug at, poked at through the writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Jews missed the forest of what Jesus represented because they were so focused on the trees rather than on the forest, or maybe on their petrified forest.
Haha, maybe.
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe. Well, today's Christendom reminds us of kind of the similar scenario. We are reminded that there are ways that we have the adherence and the allegiance and even worship of current church laws, bureaucracy, methods, and traditions. And our focus and our emphasis on those is more important than the gospel of Jesus Christ. Our concern over the way it's done in our church, the way this looks in our church, is more important to us than are we loving God and loving our neighbor. We get worked up over that letter of the law versus the spirit or the intent of the law. We find it necessary to focus on details and every exception and every possibility, and we get all bogged down with, well, what if this, and what if that, and what if this? And the whole time, we're really missing out on that basic structure of that original 10 commandments that help us love God and love others. We give way too much importance to issues that truly have little significance in the long arc of history.
Well said.
Thank you.
So are the rules and traditions made for us or made for God? Right? I mean, Jesus even said, is the Sabbath made for God or made for man? And I think that's an important question, right? Paul, in his letters, is unapologetic about where he places worship of the law over the worship of God. And, he was a Pharisee, so it even has even more power in it knowing that. In Galatians 3, he calls the followers there fools. Try that and see what happens in the church, right? His anger is directed at the Christians in Galatia because through their words, deeds, and motives, they were promoting a religion based on the law, not on faith in Jesus. Now, verse 11 in chapter 3 summarizes his teaching here. It says, "Now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law. For the one who is righteous will live by faith." How powerful is that? In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, he calls the work of the law death. That's pretty powerful. The work of the law is death, and the works of the Spirit, glory. So he asked, which one represents Christ? And so if one represents Christ, why do we focus on the other? And it's interesting that was the issue then, even in the beginning of the church, and it's still the issue today.
History repeats itself,
Yeah.
indeed.
In some ways, that's really sad.
Yeah. We believe the structures of the church have insulated us from seeing the forest from the trees. A study done nearly 10 years ago revealed that more than 75% of people who regularly came to worship did not expect that worship service to be a spiritual experience.
Wow, 3 out of 4.
3 out of 4 people did not expect to be able to feel God moving in that worship moment.
But wait, it gets worse.
And that same study found that among pastors, people who have dedicated their life to serving God, people who supposedly have, a close relationship with God, right?
Pedestal relationship.
Their percentage was closer to 90%. So 9 out of 10 pastors didn't even expect God to show up at the worship that they were leading. I read this study at the very beginning of my ministry, and I was actually very thankful because it broke my heart. And I thought, as a pastor, if I don't even expect God to show up, why would any of my church people expect that?
Mm-hmm.
And it caused me to say, well, then what am I even doing?
Mm-hmm.
And I vowed right then and there that I would let my spirit show, that I would expect God to be moving. I would name when God is moving, and that I would try my best to lead worship as a connection of human and divine.
So if only 1 out of 10 pastors expects that, and you're the one, where does that put me?
Well, I hope you're the 1 out of the next 10.
Okay.
I hope. I know that both of us feel passionate about the church that we serve in. And we know that some of these ideas that we're talking about and some of the critiques that we have are hard to hear. And they're hard to hear for us too. Because, I certainly have my rigidity about worship, the way I like it and the things that I want the church to be. And I have to temper it with this idea of, is God telling me something different? Is this a really important in the long arc of history? Mm-hmm. Is this consistent with the abundant life of Christ?
Exactly.
So one of the questions we have to ask ourselves when it comes to worship then is, if we're not coming for a spiritual experience, if we're not coming to relate with God and expect God to relate with us, then what are we coming for?
Right.
Why are we watching online or on Facebook? Or why are we even listening on the radio? Mm-hmm. Why are we even doing this thing called church?
Right.
If we don't expect it to do anything or mean anything.
Yeah. It's a great question. Great question. And what we have concluded through our experience of leading 10 different churches between us, through our years of ministry, and through conversations with our colleagues, lots of conversations, is that the American church stopped being a religious experience after World War II. If you recall from our last session, that the war rocked the people that were in it. I mentioned, the death camps as probably the worst example of that. But many others. And as such, we almost have a generation, our grandparents' generation or our great-grandparents' generation, depending on your age as you're watching this, maybe even your parents' generation, became functional atheists. Right? They spoke it, but they didn't believe it. But because they were good Americans, they and they loved connections, and they loved the socialization and the fellowship, continued to be a part of the church and became leaders in the church. And so the greatest generation, as they're called, were not rule breakers, unlike their kids, the baby boomers. Oh, those boomers,
Yeah.
right? So as a group, they wanted America to prosper. And the way in which America had always prospered was when the church was strong. And as such, they made that commitment as a group, unconsciously even as a group, to do that. Yet because of the war experience and the Depression experience, the Holocaust, a fundamental shift occurred, which was that the church was no longer the place to find or even to go and search for God.
So you're saying we basically took God
Yeah.
out of the church.
Yeah, and when the glory days of the church are seen as the 50s, this is the era that we're talking about. And yet the search for God within the walls of the building, anyway, disappeared.
So we're going to give you a chance to think about some questions related to this. And we're diving into what is the nature of the church? Why church? Why go to church? What is the church's function? Those kinds of thoughts. So we're going to give you some questions to think about here with your group. And so we invite you to pause and think about these questions. And Patrick, you'll put some of these up on the screen. Is that right?
I will.
Okay. So thinking about this, what did you miss most about church during this pandemic time? What did the pandemic changes cause you to miss the most at the church? And thinking about that idea, the quote from Paul that Patrick read, would Paul consider that part of the law or part of the Spirit? Okay. Would you say that your faith in God is stronger now than what it was at the start of 2020? What has this experience of worshiping in a different way over the last year done with your faith? Is it about the same or is it less? How is it different? How is it the same?
Or more.
And more, yeah. And what does that say about the nature of the church experience? What does that say if your faith has actually grown more, but you haven't worshiped in the same way? Does that have any implications? Or maybe you've fallen away from the church. Maybe you're watching this video because it came across and you're like, oh, wow, I haven't seen them for a long time. And let me see what's going on with Patrick and Abby in the churches. And you happen to catch this. What does it mean in the different ways that you've expressed your faith over the year and how that relates to the church? So, those are quite a few questions, but we invite you to pause here for a moment and take a thought about those.
It's a pretty hefty subject area, and probably a view in which many of you had never thought of before, or pieced together in that way before. And so, one of the things I always say, Abby, is that we are paid to think differently.
Right.
And so it's a different way of thinking about things. Well, so let's continue then on our journey. So following World War II, as I said before the pause, the church became simply another place within society to make friends and build relationships. And if you recall that during the post-World War II era is really when the middle class blossomed and actually became a force within our society. And it was, right in those post-war years,
So
which
1950s, 60s, 70s.
Well, yeah, particularly the 50s and 60s. Yeah, especially during that time. And so, as the middle class boomed, so did church attendance and church builds. And many things within the church blossomed as well to create a social fabric, to create networks and bring groups of people together in ways in which the church had not before World War II. When you're out on the prairie, in a frontier town, church looks and community looks a lot differently than it did after World War II. And so, whatever veneer of that facade that was established after World War II, whatever has remained over those 80 years since, I think the pandemic has completely wiped off. And so the pandemic has created a rawness about the nature of the church. And simply because coffee hours aren't happening, a lot of groups aren't meeting, right? They can't do a potluck, and imagine how many dishes scooping out of a common crock pot would create to prevent the spread of the virus. So all of those social aspects of the church aren't happening right now.
Right.
And with these reduced, this aspect, which has really been the growth of the mainline Protestant movement in the latter part of the 20th century, there's a spiritual, only the spiritual side is left, and because our focus hasn't been on that, it's really as if the church itself has died, because we don't have the spiritual components in place, the discipleship paths, the robust small group ministries, active men's group, active women's group. I know that they exist, but they're certainly not what they were, and they haven't been, at least in our experience, they really haven't been strong on the spiritual side, much more on the social side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that, just hearing that out loud, it does make my heart heavy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saddened to think about this. And as I've talked to some folks over the last few months, though, I've been trying to express it in this way. And Patrick, I'm thankful for the study because it's really helped put some context to how I'm feeling. Is that basically we have lost a lot of the social pieces of the church with the pandemic. And then when we look at what's left, we have Sunday morning worship.
Right.
And
which is lagging, in attendance, and you can't do all those law parts of worship, so.
And it's been hard for us to say, what can we do differently?
Yeah.
Because we are mourning what we can't do.
Right. And that's okay. Grief is good. You got to have it.
It's normal.
Yeah.
I guess where I'm going with that is it's hard for us as established institutional people to just say, okay, God, we can't do it that way, but what do you have for us instead? It's hard for us to draw deep in that well of life and energy and creativity that God gives us because we kind of like our institution and the way, though, if I dare say it, the way things have always been. Yeah. So
we like Jeremiah 29, right? About I'm going to do a new thing as long as it looks like the old thing.
That's one way to put it.
Yes.
Yeah. So if you're hearing this and going, well, gosh, don't you all have anything positive to say? We want you to know that we're feeling the pain right along with you.
Indeed.
It's not an easy time to pastor in either, when we know that we are leading the church through unprecedented change. Not
in the wilderness.
Not just because of the church, but also because of our social position, because of our historical position, and even our political position. So I guess what I'm trying to say is hang in there. We're with you. And the very nature of this study is to ask good questions and to see how we feel about these things and what is the hope. So here we go. Douglas John Hall, who wrote this book, The End of Christendom and the Future of Christianity, that we've been using to help frame this study. I believe that the future the Christian movement can have is a significant one. There's our hope.
Good news.
Yes. And we will be able to claim it only if we give up trying to cling to the Christendom model. Just as the Jews missed seeing Jesus as the Savior due to their rigidity and adherence to the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law, we too have missed out on sharing the good news of salvation in Christ with generations of our friends, neighbors, and colleagues. Due to our rigidity of our traditions, our bureaucracy, our institutionalism, basically our marriage of that phrase, well, this is the way we always do it.
Yep. It's said that the average United Methodist invites someone who doesn't go to church in any place on Sunday mornings once every 40 years.
Oh, friends, we can
Like
do
a
better than
wilderness
that.
time, right?
Yes.
Every 40 years. I used to, when I first heard that, I thought, well, it's every 40 years, whether we like it or not. It's just kind of a phrase. Well, anyway, in the 1960s, as the baby boomers were coming of age, Martin Luther King Jr. said that the 10 o'clock hour on Sunday morning was the most segregated hour of the week. Right, and we mentioned this last week as well, right? I mean, that's not me saying that. I would agree with his statement, right? It's not Billy Graham saying that. It's Martin Luther King Jr. saying that. And the reason why I want to make sure that you hear that part is, Martin Luther King Jr. would have known a segregated hour when he saw one.
Sure.
Much more than I would have as a white male. And so when he says that it's the most segregated hour of the week, that is powerful and meaningful for me. And today I would add in classism. It's not necessarily as a race, but class to that same element as and in part, I think that's a part of the fellowship socialization side of things, because middle class or upper middle class folks have an entirely different worldview, as we've looked at through our poverty work, and so therefore you tend to congregate together in like-mindedness in like groups.
Yeah. So maybe a simpler way of saying all that is that we come to church to be with our own friends.
Yeah, with people like us.
Yeah, we come to church to be with the people that are already there.
Mm-hmm.
We have lost the sight of Jesus's command to go fish for people, to go make disciples. And so part of our job as church people is to bring in new people into our fold, to increase our circle of friends and bring in someone new. And
to collect the manna, as I talked about in my sermon last week.
Exactly.
Well, this Christendom model is facing major pushback now more than ever. The rapid decline of the mainline Protestant denominations is really Exhibit A. As Hall writes on page 27, the answers that the fellowship Christianity provided to humans or to human needs are inadequate to the questions that have arisen in the post-war decades. The depletion of the mainstream churches seems directly related, I believe, to this discrepancy. pretty bad.
Yeah, over and over again, we hear that the church is not relevant to me. And I think that's what he's speaking about there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, those born around the turn of the 21st century, that's around year 2000, are now major forces and drivers for change in our culture. And their whole lives have been in the digital era. They don't remember a time without a smartphone or a smartwatch or some kind of digital device that is giving them information constantly and keeping them connected.
Asking the refrigerator for the forecast.
Asking the refrigerator for the forecast. Oh, Patrick, you're going to have to help me with that one.
A smart refrigerator. Alexa, it's on the refrigerator.
I see what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay, so you can ask Alexa and get whatever you need. I see what you're saying.
See our generation?
You can tell. I have to work hard to continue to move with change.
Yes.
There's a part of me that wants to stay right in my good old 1980s, which is my comfort era, right? Okay. So these folks, they see things bluntly as they are. They don't know how to varnish their observations of the world. They see it and they name it and they say it as it is. They believe that the church should be the place where one comes to learn about Christ, to grow deeper in that relationship, and to make a difference in the world. They don't want church to be the hub of their social life. They don't need the church to come and be in various social groups. They're getting that elsewhere. In addition, their time is so limited that they won't attend, participate, or join in groups, clubs, or churches that have no intentional purpose or that don't strive at every moment to achieve what their stated purpose is supposed to be. Again, they're not going to come and just sit around and gab. They're too busy for that. They want to make a difference. And friends, that's honestly why we don't see many young people in churches.
The depletion, right? They're being depleted out, is all it says.
The fellowship model that we have been talking about here, that emphasis on social connections, not spiritual ones. That fellowship model fails to attract young folks. And most churches don't have a discipleship system. Patrick mentioned this a little bit earlier. They don't have a discipleship plan or a system to help people grow in the faith. Sometimes our Bible studies don't even really talk about the Bible. We still say that they're a Bible study, but really they're a small fellowship group where we get together and talk socially with one another. So our young folks see that and they name it for what it is. That's a group that gets together and talks with each other. They're not studying the Bible. And so they don't find what they're looking for, and hence they turn away. What they want is help in exploring the mystery of the faith and help to engage in activities that make a difference in people's lives. Those are the ministries and the ways to connect with our young folks. And as church leaders, we have to be willing to grieve what we've lost, to accept some change, and to make places for meaningful connections for our future.
Yeah. So as a way of exploring this area in your life, we invite you to visit with some people who are 25 and under that you know, or maybe need to get to know, right? Maybe they're the manna that God has sent to you to collect. Engage them in any way possible, which may mean that you end up using your phone through texting or other social media applications to help them be comfortable right? To give them their certainty of conversation so that you can help them to open up about their experience of faith. Right? So ask them to define truth, justice, relationship, and community. And any other words that maybe come to mind as we've been talking in this session. See how their definitions are different from yours, because they're going to be. They're going to be. We will refund all of the money you have paid for this study.
All of it.
All of it, double even, if they're the same. That's how much we know it's going to be different, right? Ask them if they would be more inclined to come to church to hear and sing hymns out of our hymnal. And only those 10 that we know, right? Okay. Or to conduct a weekend of community service. Which one would be more appealing to them? Which one's more appealing to you? And maybe in this conversation, you can start to see that it's just different. It's not necessarily better or worse, despite some of my sarcasm. But that things are changing, and the church that changes to meet the needs of our 21st century is going to be the church that's around. God will be strong. It's just, how will God work in the world? How will God's purposes be fulfilled in the world? So take a few minutes and do that, or make a phone call, or send a text, or whatever it is that you need to do to have that conversation and be enlightened, and then pick up where you left off.
Welcome back. We hope that you had a great discussion, hopefully cross generations, to see what some of our younger folks believe and some of their opinions on these topics related to church life. Last week we talked about 4 quests that come from Hall's book that are concrete ways to pursue the hope of the church for the future. And these 4 quests really parallel these characteristics of the younger generations that we've been talking about here.
They do.
And so those young adults who are now the change agents and decision makers in our society have these characteristics that really go along with these 4 quests. So to review those 4, they are the quest for moral authenticity. Again, we talked about how younger adults are blunt. They don't believe in being nice for just to be nice.
Right.
They're going to call out the truth. So moral authenticity, meaningful community, the transcendence and mystery. Again, making a difference in our world, but also leaving places for questioning, placings for, I wonder how that works. What does God think about that? And then finally, the last one is meaning. So moral authenticity, meaningful community, transcendence and mystery, and the quest for meaning. The gospel of Jesus Christ fulfills these quests. But are we as the church willing to be the place where that gospel is truly evident? Patrick, you just said God is strong.
Yeah, absolutely.
And God is working in our world through these quests. But the question is God going to work with these quests and all these people over here?
Right.
Beyond the structure, the scope of the church? I believe we're already seeing that happen.
Yes, we are.
So far, in the 21st century, we, the church, have said no. We are not willing to be that place. We're not ready for change. We're not ready to grieve our losses. We're not ready to look at it differently. And as such, young adults are seeking these quests elsewhere and are leaving the church far behind.
Yep. On page 20, Hull writes, why are we, meaning the North American Protestants, why are we still so thoroughly wedded to Christendom that we refuse to entertain consciously this great transition through which we are passing, right? Doesn't matter whether we want to or not, whether we've initiated or not. It's happening.
We are here.
We are here. We are passing through this wilderness, right? We're in that time. And he goes on, he says, and therefore, because we're not willing, because we refuse to entertain that, right, we fail to engage in the kind of radical assessment and reforming of our calling, our mission, our structures, and ministries that would enable us perhaps to pass through this paradigm shift, right, to get to the promised land with greater self-understanding and a more faithful and imaginative kind of obedience. Ooh, you may want to rewind that, hit the back 10 seconds on the broadcast just to hear that again, because there's a lot there that Hall says in that sentence.
Right.
Yeah.
And as I look through that again, I think a simpler way to say that is, why are we being so stubborn? and I can really ask that question because I am one stubborn person.
Boy, preach it.
Why are we being so stubborn to fail to see all of the goodness and the beauty and the exciting things that God is doing? And yet we want to just push back and keep our church the way it is. So how do you respond to that? Again, talk to a young person and see what they say. Compare your responses. There's a lot to digest here. I've already paused a couple moments to offer some pastoral care, probably to myself, if more than anything.
Probably. Yeah.
As I love the church, and I love the things we do, and I also recognize our need for change. So we've covered in our sessions over 1,000 years of church history, and even primordial history in our Bible as we think about the Israelite story.
Right, exactly.
So we've mixed in some sociology here and also some demographic learning. And so there's a lot here. It's important that our view of God, Jesus, and the church not be seen in isolation from all of these other factors,
Right.
but in communion with the entirety of all of that. Because remember, God is bigger than all of these questions, all of these institutions. And, maybe it is a calling to go back to think about, what are those 10 commandments? What container did that give us? To love God and love others. And if that's what's most important, then what of all this other stuff can we set aside? What can we and younger leaders agree on is a way to love God and love neighbor? Does it fit with the 10 commandments? And if so, can we go with it? Or do we have to nitpick it apart for every detail and every possibility? I don't know. This is why we're doing this study, to have us think about these things and to remember that God is still doing something among us and God gives us hope.
Absolutely. So next week we will conclude our study as we get near to the end of Lent. Isn't that?
It's hard to believe it's already here. 5 weeks gone
I
by.
know, and then we'll prepare for Holy Week. So as we conclude, we're going to peer in on the Israelites as they do their best imitation of the phrase, "When the cat's away, the mice will play."
Yes, indeed.
So you're not going to want to miss the conclusion of our looking at the Israelites and our present day journey in the wilderness.
We have the wilderness then and the wilderness now. Thank you for participating and joining in with us. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Indeed.
Bye-bye.
Bye.